Welcome to this session of the Dole Institute of Politics virtual post-election conference. Our guest is a previous guest at one of our post-election conferences, Katie Glueck, who is a writer for the New York Times. Katie, it's great that you can join us here today.
Great to be with you. Thanks so much for having me back.
Yeah, well, we're delighted to see you again. Let's go back and kind of set the stage for the election. I believe you said you spent virtually all your time covering the president-elect's campaign. Could you just talk about what the lay of the land looked at the beginning of the year on the Democratic side?
Sure. So I started covering Joe Biden from virtually the first day that he announced, started right around then. And at the time, he entered the field as the sort of nominal front runner, but there was a lot of skepticism over whether he would be able to maintain that position. At the time when he got in, there was a lot of debate over the future of the Democratic Party, over really where the energy was within the party. And there were a lot of skeptics who felt that Joe Biden was too old. They felt that he was too moderate. They felt that he was too rooted in the politics of the past to really connect with what some in the party saw as the kind of ascendant, younger, more progressive forces. And so really from the day that he got in, certainly had all the name ID and was viewed broadly as the front runner. And so he faced a lot of scrutiny over whether he would be able to hold that position.
And he got off to a pretty weak start as well.
Sure. Well, he came in fourth place in the Iowa caucuses, I think fifth place in the New Hampshire primary. He didn't win in Nevada either. And certainly in Iowa and New Hampshire, at least, there were a lot of moments, even within his campaign, where there were, some concerns about whether that was in fact the end. But of course, it was his strong and enduring support with more moderate, older African-American voters who revived his candidacy and propelled him to the nomination.
Yes, and I want to talk about that in just a second, but I want to ask your opinion. A lot of pundits were declaring Biden dead right before South Carolina. And I always found that astounding when I would hear it, given what you just said about the president-elect's strong strength among African-American voters and the fact that the race was going to South Carolina. Why did so many people get that wrong?
So certainly not everyone got that wrong, and if you talk to some of Joe Biden's most important supporters, starting with Jim Clyburn in South Carolina, there was that view that just wait till he got into some of the more diverse states that they argued, I think rightfully were more reflective of the party, and they were, and their case was that Biden had those deep connections and would be in a position to take off. But to take a step back, and I think maybe more specifically to your question about why there was so much feeling in some corners of the party that Biden was about done, was because he had positioned himself as the electability candidate. His argument from the very beginning of the campaign was that, in his view, the country was in a national emergency. The most important thing to do was to nominate someone who would have broad enough appeal to defeat Donald Trump. And so, there was this argument that if you are the electability candidate, your entire message is around this idea that you can win, that you can defeat Donald Trump, then you got to win. And those losses in those first three contests really stoked a lot of doubts over whether he was in fact a strong enough candidate to be able to deliver on just that.
Well, after the big win in South Carolina, it pretty much became a steamroller, didn't it?
It did. And so, and then it turned out that Biden's bet about what was driving the forces within the Democratic Party, it turned out that he was right. And that, as it related to this idea that nothing else mattered besides this question of who could defeat Donald Trump. And there were a lot of voters who saw him gain that momentum coming out of South Carolina and say, okay, it looks like he's emerging. Let's get on board. Let's turn our attention to the general election.
And then about 2 weeks into March, the pandemic, which people had known about, but it became really super serious at that point. States began closing down. How did the Biden campaign respond to the pandemic?
Oh gosh, I have very vivid memories of those 2 weeks because I was with him for part of that. And, so going into March, he had, to take a step back, he, was coming off the South Carolina victory. There was this big question of could he translate that success into Super Tuesday states where he had virtually no organization on the ground. He had virtually no money. And there was a lot of question about whether he would be able to build on that momentum sufficiently. And he was able to, and he, did have a plane, and he went to Texas, and he went to California, and he went to Alabama, in the sort of final hours before Super Tuesday, and ended up racking up a lot of victories. And, I was on a plane, a press plane following him, and have a very vivid memory of getting a text from a source asking what it was like to be flying at that time. And, did I feel safe out there? And, on the plane, the flight attendant was giving out all kinds of bottles of hand sanitizer and all that. And so, we thought, you want to be careful, but no one really thought like within a week everything would come to a halt. But that's actually in fact what happened. After Super Tuesday, he went on to campaign in a number of other states that would vote. I believe it was that following Tuesday in March. But as those contests were closing in places like Michigan, it was becoming increasingly clear that the country was actually potentially headed into a crisis. And so after he racked up that sort of second string of victories following Super Tuesday, they started canceling events. And I remember there was a big question about whether he would be going down to Florida. And they ended up canceling that and tried to pivot fairly quickly to virtual campaigning and not without bumps along the way. But I distinctly remember, I think it was a Thursday in March, where he gave this speech in Wilmington, Delaware, not too far from his home. And he is, as I recall, talked about the sort of potentially dangerous moment we were going into. And then he was essentially grounded for months, and, he did not leave, sort of his hometown for campaigning for a very long time. And so it took them some time, certainly, to recalibrate to campaigning in kind of this virtual environment. And, they faced a lot of scrutiny over just how that was going.
Right. Well, obviously, the two campaigns took a very different approach to how they operated in the pandemic. I'm curious, what were some of the thoughts that the Biden campaign team shared with you about how the Trump campaign was operating?
So the Trump campaign, certainly, and I went to this too. I remember a big rally that they held down in Tulsa, Oklahoma, and there, that was one of the early signs that the Trump campaign, despite the pandemic, despite the concerns about the virus and social distancing and masks, that they were in fact going to continue to proceed with campaigning essentially as usual. So the Biden campaign, they tried to take that as yet another piece of evidence in terms of the broader argument that Biden was the responsible candidate when it came to handling the virus. And in their argument that Trump was not, for a whole host of reasons. But, they really tried to cast the entire campaign as a referendum on Trump's stewardship of the virus. And yeah, I think now that we have the results, you can sort of debate how effective that was in various places, which I'd be happy to talk about. But certainly at that time, when the Biden campaign was doing everything virtually and Trump was out there holding these large rallies, that was one additional piece of their argument that we are the best stewards in this moment of crisis.
Right. Well, let's shift gears. At the end of May, we had the terrible killing of George Floyd, and racial justice protests broke out around the country. How did the campaign respond to that?
Mm-hmm. So in one of Biden's, I think it was really his first major trip outside of Delaware or outside of neighboring Philadelphia, very near his home, he went to go and meet with members of the Floyd family. And he gave a speech where he sought to empathize with so many Americans around the country who were really in deep pain over what they saw with the killing of George Floyd, and sought to very much stand with the protesters against racial injustice. That ended up becoming one of the most significant pieces of his campaign message. He talked about all the crises the nation is facing, whether they're economic crises or whether it's an economic crisis, a public health crisis, and the crisis of racial injustice was another one that he very much centered on, and that became a defining element of this campaign.
One of the things that changed, about the presidential campaign this year is virtual conventions. Kind of talk a little bit about how the Biden folks, who committed much earlier to a virtual convention than the Trump campaign, talk a little bit about how they went about the planning and the approach, and then give us your assessment on how both those conventions worked.
Sure. So again, the Biden campaign throughout the general election tried really hard to be guided by this principle that they were the responsible campaign when it came to dealing with this virus. How could they show leadership in terms of dealing with the virus, by modeling at every turn public health recommendations? We should note that they did face a lot of scrutiny over this approach within their own party, and a lot of pushback on the ground, and some people in places like Florida who argued that had they in fact been a little bit more flexible in terms of their approach there, then perhaps they might have had a different result in some of the places that did not go as they had hoped. But to focus specifically on how the conventions played out, the Democratic convention was almost entirely virtual. The exceptions were Kamala Harris did give a speech in person in Wilmington, Delaware, and Joe Biden did as well, and I was there for that speech. But it was surreal, because this is a man who was first elected to office to the U.S. Senate in 1972, and certainly we know from our reporting, for decades has been thinking about becoming president of the United States, and so he finally hits this really seminal moment in his career. He's accepting the nomination finally after 2 failed presidential bids, after all this skepticism at the beginning of his third presidential bid, and he's accepting the nomination in this dark room. The only people, maybe a couple of aides were there in the back, but otherwise the only people in this dark room at this Wilmington Convention Center were reporters, and were obviously looking at him pretty stone-faced. It's not the job of reporters to encourage him or applaud him as he's accepting the nomination. And and he was speaking direct to camera, and so he was giving a speech to the nation. But that's actually what it was like in the room, which it just had to be so surreal for him. And then he came out and he waved to a number of his actual supporters in Wilmington who had assembled in a drive-in rally. So he was there. His running mate was there, his wife was there, and there were fireworks, and they waved and all of that. But, it was totally socially distanced. Almost the entire campaign was conducted virtually. And of course, in stark contrast to the Republican event where there were a lot of in-person speeches, and President Trump did have an audience, at times for him.
Okay. Before we move on and get into the general election, I want to ask you kind of a question that's more about how you've operated. How has it been to cover a campaign during the pandemic, and describe how different it's been?
Sure. It's been wildly different, as this year has been for every American, I think. But, it was quite jarring to go from being on that plane and following Biden around, hitting multiple states in a day ahead of Super Tuesday, to just coming to a grinding halt. And for months, he was not out on the campaign trail, and I wasn't either. By the summer, that started to change. So like I mentioned, I went to President Trump's rally in Oklahoma. I went to North Carolina to talk with voters. I went to Wilmington to cover this largely virtual convention, and certainly looked for ways to get out there, to be on the ground, to see this presidential campaign unfolding, even under these incredibly strange circumstances. But typically you would be on the plane with the nominee all the time in a general election, and you'd be crisscrossing the country, and you would continue to be hitting multiple states in a day. I was fortunate to get to come back to Kansas for a little bit and do some work from there. So socially distant during the pandemic, and I got to write a little bit about the Senate race there. But certainly under typical circumstances, you wouldn't be going home much at all.
Mm-hmm. Can you kind of give us the Biden campaign path to victory, or their theory of how they were going to win the general election?
Sure. So they felt from the very beginning that he, as I think we talked about earlier, had the broadest appeal out of the Democrats who were running. They believed, based on his longstanding relationships with African American leaders, that he would have strong support among Black voters, that he would, be able, as the Democratic nominee, be able to engage kind of the broad coalition that had, as we saw in the 2018 elections, had rejected Donald Trump. They believed, Joe Biden's from, as he often talks about, from Scranton, Pennsylvania. He grew up as a sort of, or he frames himself as someone who you can connect with blue collar, white working class Americans, and they argue that he would be able to cut into Trump's support there, I think with some mixed results. And they argued that he had strong appeal with moderate suburbanites, who some of whom maybe typically did vote Republican, but were very uncomfortable with the direction of the party in the Trump era. And I think taken together, they were right on some elements of the theory of the case. They were wrong on others. But ultimately, he was able to assemble a coalition that included some voters who typically are not considered Democrats, including some center-right seniors who are typically a pretty strong Republican constituency. At the same time, he was weaker with voters, some voters who had powered President Obama's coalition. And so we got some very interesting results coming out of this general election that I think is going to lead to some soul searching potentially with operatives on both sides of the aisle.
Mm-hmm. In mid-September, there were two pretty significant things that happened, and I'd like to just get your perspective on these things, and also kind of what the Biden campaign response was. On September 15th, Bob Woodward published Rage, which got a lot of national attention, and then 3 days later, Justice Ginsburg passed. How did that affect the Biden campaign, and kind of give us your assessment of how that played into the overall narrative of the campaign?
Well, as I recall, there was reporting that came out, I believe from Mr. Woodward, that tied to when President Trump knew reportedly about just how severe the pandemic could be, and certainly that reporting was something that Joe Biden, if I'm remembering the sequence correctly, that he and his campaign very much seized on, and then again used that to press their narrative about how much this race should be a referendum on who can lead the country out of the pandemic. And then in terms of Justice Ginsburg, I mean, that was an event that at the time injected a lot of uncertainty into the race. There was this question of, with the Supreme Court opening, which side of the aisle does that mobilize? Does that, for voters who are traditionally more conservative but don't like President Trump's style, does that bring them home to him? Does that have implications for key Senate races? For Joe Biden, it injected this complicated issue of how does he talk about this issue of court packing, which had gained steam with some on the left. It's an issue that seemed to be maybe a complicated fit for Biden, who has cast himself as this total institutionalist, but and then he declined to kind of take a position on that for weeks. But so certainly injected uncertainty, and whether that was ultimately decisive for him, I think is maybe a different issue, but was one of intense focus for several weeks there.
Mm-hmm. Then on September 27th, the Times published the story on the president's finances. How did the Biden campaign respond to that?
Well, it was interesting because I was in, I think it was in Pennsylvania and Ohio, shortly after that happened. And I was talking with folks who were living in, fairly Trump-friendly areas. And a number of them pointed to that story and raised some questions about how President Trump's approach to his own taxes had played out. And, we're feeling a little bit miffed, based on how they had approached their own obligations, and were quite caught off guard by our reporting on how President Trump had approached his. But for Biden, it was another data point in this idea that Trump is not a real fighter for the working person, and that he would be. That was his argument.
Mm-hmm. How did the Biden campaign prepare for the debates?
How did they prepare for the debates? He is someone who likes to do a lot of reading, is our understanding. And so he had extensive briefing books. He had practice sessions, with an aide who would play Donald Trump. And, there was a lot of thought and preparation put into those debates because, the campaign, based on polling, and the polling did not end up being exactly accurate, but, based on the polling, it seemed to them and it seemed to a lot of observers that, Joe Biden was on a path to victory in this race, but they, I think, rightfully saw the debates as moments that had the potential to be key inflection points in the race and moments that had the potential, if anything was going to reset the race, they thought it could be those debates, especially for voters who, maybe were, there were not a ton of undecided voters in this race, but to the extent there were some, there were some undecided voters who had some questions about Joe Biden's age and just had some questions about whether he is still at the agility, and that was going to be a pretty important test for him, especially because President Trump was making, frankly, a lot of false claims about Joe Biden's mental acuity, and so there was, a lot of interest in making sure that he came across as strong as possible.
Well, then, Katie, the first debate actually happens. What was your assessment of that?
Oh, what a mess. What a mess, right? I mean, it was, we spoke with a lot of voters after that debate who were just, even as ugly as American politics has in many ways become, who were just completely stunned by just how ugly that debate went. Biden himself had suggested that perhaps he at times went a little bit far, but I spoke with a lot of voters who were horrified by, including voters who are not necessarily huge fans of Joe Biden, but were kind of horrified at how President Trump had talked about Joe Biden's son. But then, of course, and I don't mean to get ahead of you, but then that all ended up being overshadowed with, of course, the COVID testing for President Trump just a couple days after, if I'm remembering that timing right.
Right, your timing is right on, and that was my next question. So you set it up, perfectly for me. The president, I believe it was a Friday, they announced that he had tested positive, and that same week. So you had the Trump campaign had a week from hell that week because you had the New York Times story, then you had the first debate, then you had the former campaign manager of the president having that very public meltdown down in Florida, and then the president tests positive. What were your personal thoughts about that week? But then also kind of share with us what the Biden folks, how they reacted to that week.
I remember it was a very tiring week. And I don't know if I get to say that compared with my colleagues who were covering President Trump, because, that was a story that was unfolding under even more pressure and scrutiny. But, I just remember distinctly once that news came out that President Trump had tested positive, the White House said, then, that just became such a huge story and such a huge moment of uncertainty in the whole race, because of course just a couple of days prior he and Joe Biden had shared a stage. Some of their top supporters and family members had shared an auditorium, and so there was just this kind of scramble to get a sense of whether Joe Biden in fact had had perhaps gotten close enough that he might be at risk as well. And so there was just this big scramble to get an understanding of when was he going to get a test, what did the test say, how many tests was he going to have, what was his testing routine going to be like? Was he going to continue to travel? And he did continue to travel that day, as I recall. But certainly through in a race that had already been so extraordinary in so many ways. I mean, just another layer of real crisis into the campaign, to have the president of the United States test positive for this deadly disease, and his fellow septuagenarian who was standing nearby him, and so it was a really interesting moment, and I mean a perilous moment really for the country, just in terms of what was going to happen with the health of these two leaders.
Mm-hmm. How did the Biden campaign react vis-a-vis the second debate then?
So as I recall, that debate was moved because there were some concerns, about the testing and about proximity to President of the United States who had tested positive. And, Joe Biden had, I think prior to that moment, they had not been especially transparent about when he was getting tested and how often he was being tested. And from then on, they did, and under some pressure and scrutiny from the news media, they did start relaying more about when he was, at least about what the results were of his test. But suddenly it threw into pretty sharp relief. Health is always really important. The questions of health for these presidential candidates, but especially older presidential candidates, especially in the midst of a pandemic, and the importance of all that was underscored just even more.
Mm-hmm. Talk a little bit about that last debate and how you thought that went as compared to the first one.
The last debate. I will be honest. I'm trying to remember. There's been so many developments since then.
Yeah, it was a much more conventional debate. I mean, a lot of people have said that if Trump had done in the first debate what he did in the only other debate that the two presidential candidates, I should have clarified the chronology better on that, but a lot of people felt that Trump did a lot better in the second, and I was just curious about your thoughts and also what the Biden campaign thought.
That's right. Forgive me. Sorry. Every day in this campaign has felt like a lifetime since then. Yes, there was the feeling, among a lot of observers that, had Trump, exactly as you said, had President Trump delivered that kind of performance from the outset, had he refrained from things like the really, in the eyes of many, pretty vicious attacks on Joe Biden's family, for example, then perhaps that first debate would have been viewed differently. And, that this came against the backdrop of a lot of speculation about whether President Trump was eager to go further with attacks on, and we should say baseless attacks for, on Joe Biden's family, on his son. And as I recall, he ended up not really going there in the way that people had expected in that final debate. Ultimately, it did not change the trajectory of the race for him. But it did not perhaps end up being like the seminal moment one way or the other, the kind of defining moment that maybe it could have been had it gone, sharply in one direction or the other.
Mm-hmm. The 2008 and 2012 Obama campaigns did an extraordinary job building organization and communicating with people. During the pandemic, obviously that changed. How did the Biden people approach their ground game?
Mm-hmm. How did they approach their ground game? Well, they sought to make it virtual for a large part of the general election. They did all kinds of Zoom meetings, and Joe Biden would call in and hold kind of virtual rallies. They did that for a little bit with limited success, but they tried to do that. And he would do virtual roundtables, and they would do all kinds of calls and videos with their surrogates and kind of virtual events. Really quite similar to how many businesses are operating. I will tell you, when we reported on this at the time, I mean, there was a lot of concern about whether that was sufficient, in some of the key battleground states, and there were a lot of party chairs and county chairs and local officials and local elected and state and frankly some national elected officials who had some real concerns about whether that was sufficient, especially because the Republicans were in fact out there knocking on doors and they were out there holding in-person events, and as much as that was counter to the Biden campaign's claim that they as much as doing that, there was some concern among Biden folks that would perhaps undermine their claim that they were the responsible campaign in terms of operating in a pandemic. There were a lot of Democrats who worried that they were just getting outmatched on the ground.
Mm-hmm. What about expenditures? How did the campaign budget its money and speak to the size of the financial advantage they had near the end?
They really raised a staggering amount of money. And that was not a given. And going into the general election, there were real questions about whether Joe Biden could catch up to the war chest that President Trump, who as president the last 4 years, has been able to assemble. But certainly they ended up pulling in just really staggering fundraising hauls. And so they were doing all kinds of advertising campaigns and launching a really serious kind of air and digital campaign effort.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Let me ask you this. What was the mood of the Biden campaign say, the last 10 days of the election? Were they really positive and upbeat, or were they cautious about expressing their opinions?
It depends on whom you ask. There was an effort a couple of weeks before election day, and then of course we ended up getting essentially election week. But a memo from the campaign manager, Jennifer O'Malley Dillon, seeking to tamp down expectations a little bit, seeking to warn Democrats and Biden allies that the race was closer than polls suggested, and trying to inject a little bit of caution there, because some of these polls were showing just really staggering leads for Biden in key battleground states. There were some people within the campaign with whom I spoke who were uneasy going into the final days of the election about where Joe Biden was with key Democratic constituencies, including younger African American voters, with Latino voters. Just questions about where turnout was going to be there. There were others who were kind of cautiously optimistic. They kept seeing all the polls, and they felt like ultimately they were in a pretty good place. I think that they thought that they were going to win. They did. I think it was a question of by how much, but they were very bullish on places throughout, like Arizona, a traditionally Republican state that, of course, did ultimately flip. But that was not a given. But they were bullish on that. I don't think that they expected the results to drag on. That sort of election week as long as they did, but varying degrees of nerves. They were all nervous, but ultimately confident that they would pull it off. I think depending on whom you spoke with, different views on what that coalition would actually look like.
Well, the polls very clearly showed, I believe the Real Clear Politics average was 8 points going in, all the national polls showing an 8-point Biden lead going into election day. Were they startled by some of the early results that started coming in, or were they pretty much aware of what was going to play out?
The election night, number one, did not go as they were expecting. There were absolutely people within the operation who had been thinking they would know. A lot of people have been thinking they would know that night, and the proof of that is the victory party that was set up for Joe Biden. Really elaborate flags and bunting, and a whole big drive-in rally assembled in Wilmington, again near his house. Absolutely, they thought that he was going to, a lot of them thought and hoped that he would come out there and give a victory speech. And he didn't. He had to go out there and basically say, hang in there, and things are looking good, but we got to be patient with democracy here a little bit. And there were a lot of people. I was there. Who had been waiting for hours to attend this drive-in rally, and they were sitting in their cars or standing outside. And, they had really hoped and expected that they would be seeing the president-elect of the United States walk out there. And they had to wait a couple of days longer.
Right. Were you surprised by the closeness of the election?
It depends on in which state, and the electoral map, the ultimate electoral map results actually are not so close in terms of the states that Biden flipped, but certainly the polls were again not right, and the coalition, I think, that did versus did not come through for him, you absolutely certainly caught, at least not speaking for myself one way or the other, but certainly based on my reporting and speaking with some of his allies, did catch some of those allies off guard, and I think probably disappointed some of them, especially when it comes to Latino voters in places like Florida, but also elsewhere in the country.
Mm-hmm. The president-elect has been frequently referred to during his career as kind of a gaffe machine. He seemed to avoid any really serious unforced errors during this campaign.
Well, I covered him in the primary, and he and had to cover all of this, and he had a whole host of verbal gaffes during the primary that we covered at the time, and he sometimes told misleading or inaccurate stories, and we covered that as well. But I don't think that it's the case that the gaffes, as much as his team hates that word, that they disappeared. But at least in the primary, ultimately they didn't matter, and there was a lot of question over not just verbal missteps, but some of his past positions on issues like the crime bill, on issues like busing, on issues like the Hyde Amendment related to abortion, like whether that very long record that was forged, that began to be forged in a very different era of American politics, whether that record, as a person with that record could still connect with today's Democratic Party. And there's a lot of scrutiny of that and a lot of skepticism of that. But ultimately, the answer in the Democratic primary was yes. And then, in terms of the general election, he still had gaffes, and, he is a candidate. And as we've talked about, I spent a lot of time covering him. There were moments where he could get defensive. There were moments when he could seem to kind of lash out and made comments for which he had to walk back or apologize. But he was running against someone who very frequently not only engaged in gaffes, but he promoted falsehoods. He trafficked in conspiracy theories, and so the scale and in terms of what voters were assessing, it appeared that they took all of that into consideration, and Biden was not pressing falsehoods, in the way that his opponent often was in the general election. And it certainly was the case that he as well, he was in a fairly controlled environment too. He loves the retail politics and loves being out there engaging with people, but just because of the pandemic, it often was a little bit of a more scripted environment too.
Well, there was just an incredible amount of sometimes self-inflicted bad news for President Trump and his campaign. On the other side, it appeared over the last couple of weeks, and I'm just curious about your thoughts on this, but it almost was like a sports contest, almost like football or basketball, where the Biden campaign is just kind of running out the clock and protecting a big lead. Was that the sense that you had at the time?
And I did a story on this the week before Election Day. They were very cautious in the final days of the race, and part of that also, it was there's a real concern that making sure that he did not get COVID, and that he did not, that his staffers didn't, especially in the final days of the race, and that had always been a concern. But no, he had a kind of a striking schedule. He especially the last 2 weeks or so of the race, he did ultimately get out there and hit up a lot of states in the final days, but it's not the case that in the last 2 weeks he was out there every single day, on the road hitting multiple states a day in the way that you would in a typical campaign. And that reflected the cautious bet that they made, that he was the responsible candidate, and that he was going to be modeling the public health guidelines as the pandemic worsened in some of these states. But absolutely, it was not traditional, and it was a bet, and it was a risky bet. Had this gone a different direction, I think that there would have been a lot of Democrats who looked back at this question of, did he leave it all on the field? But it didn't go a different direction, and he won, and so they are not engaging in those questions.
Mm-hmm. That's true. They get to avoid that this year. So could you kind of address what you believe were the main factors in the president-elect's victory?
Well, this race was always going to be a referendum one way or the other on President Trump. President Trump has really devoted supporters who are going to be with him no matter what. And he had also, in opposition to him, this really kind of interesting coalition formed, that as we saw play out in the 2018 midterm elections. And so, there was just this question of who could, at least in the Democratic primary, like what did it take to create a coalition and to excite a coalition that would defeat President Trump? That was kind of the one of the animating factors in the Democratic primary. And then in the general election, President Trump was out there quite often in this moment of national and international crisis, and was, for a lot of voters, the top of mind was the question of, how's he doing in navigating this crisis? So both President Trump, who is such a I don't know. He's a figure who really defines the room when he's in it. This kind of larger than life figure in American politics. And so, love him or not, he was always going to be really central to this race. The pandemic and the attendant economic fallout, that was always that, once that unfolded, that was going to be really central to this race. And then, there's this question and the view of Biden's supporters was that he was acceptable to sort of center-right voters in a way that maybe some of his opponents would not have been. And that was their calculation. And I think that we saw that in some of the election results. And especially interestingly, we saw a lot of ticket splitters, people who did vote for him at the top of the ticket, but kind of went back to their Republican roots down ballot. And so, all those factors certainly contributed. And then the Biden campaign would argue that, he also tried to put forth an agenda that is not, in contrast, frankly, to some of his language during the primary, that it's not just about getting back to normal, but it's about whatever normal means, but it's about, as he put it, building back better.
Mm-hmm. As you just mentioned, there was a fair amount of ticket splitting in this election, but Republicans wound up doing really quite a bit better than they expected. They did pretty well in the Senate. We still obviously have those specials coming up that will determine Senate control. But the Republicans did exceptionally well on the House side. They expected to lose seats, and I believe they actually gained seats. Given all of this that's going on, do you think the president-elect takes office with a mandate?
Well, he talked about this when he accepted victory. But it was interesting that the mandate that he said that he claimed was a mandate to really, in many ways, act in a bipartisan fashion. He, as much as he did during the general election, release a number of, pretty far-reaching policy plans, that relatively speaking were quite progressive, on issues for, including climate change, including infrastructure. So much of his message, both in the primary and in the general election, was less rooted in individual policy proposals, but more rooted in this idea that he can lower the temperature, that he can restore, some measure of bipartisanship in Washington. And I think that he faces a real test about whether that is still possible. But as part of his speech when he was claiming victory, he described that as part of the mandate.
Mm-hmm.
Now, whether Republicans think that
go ahead. I'm sorry.
No, I'm sorry. I was going to say, whether Republicans think that is the case and agree with his view of the areas where they should come together and find common ground is going to be a major challenge.
How do you think the president-elect will manage the tension between progressives and the establishment?
He's deep in those tensions already, and we have seen we saw those tensions, of course, play out and in many ways define the presidential primary. We saw them go on hold a little bit in the general election because a lot of Democrats and others were so focused on kind of single-minded on this idea that they needed to defeat President Trump. But even now we are seeing as Joe Biden releases his cabinet, his choices for his cabinet, we're seeing all kinds of backlash from any number of constituencies that feel that they played a very important role in propelling Biden to the presidency. And so it's going to be messy, and we are seeing a preview of that already.
What kind of president do you think Joe Biden will be?
What kind of president do I think Joe Biden will be? He'll be a president who faces extraordinary challenges at every level of governing and politics. And, it will be fascinating to see how he navigates all of them. And I think his whole theory of American politics and how you get things done is a theory that contributed to making him acceptable to a fairly broad political coalition, but it's going to be put to the test really like never before in office.
Okay. Do you have any thoughts you'd like to share on the Georgia runoffs?
Thoughts I'd like to share on the Georgia runoffs. It's going to be fascinating. It's kind of an unpredictable race, and it's happening against this backdrop where President Trump, has inaccurately and falsely, they stoked all kinds of doubts about the integrity of the American electoral process. And so what does that mean for his supporters in terms of believing enough in the American voting system to turn out? At the same time, there is a lot of thought that typically these races, it could well, favor Republicans, but so, I think all kinds of questions about who ultimately is mobilized. Did the president, stoke doubt, about the voting system in a way that is detrimental to his party? Are Democrats still as mobilized as they just were to turn out? Biden won Georgia in part by converting some of those more moderate voters who do tend, have historically tended to vote Republican. What do they do? He also won Georgia due in large part to organizing among a lot of African American voters, and certainly those voters are going to be pivotal in this race as well. But it's in some ways it's kind of the first test of the Republican Party in theory, post the Trump presidency, but no doubt that he continues to play just a pivotal role in shaping and defining that party, and that's put some Republicans in that state and around the country in a challenging position.
Katie, you talked a while back about the pandemic and how it affected coverage of the campaign. I'm curious, as a reporter, you've covered campaigns both ways, the traditional way and during a pandemic. Was there anything that happened during the pandemic that you think will stick around as a reporter's tool or method, or will everything just go back to the way it was before?
That's a good question. As interesting, I'm thinking here. It will be interesting to see whether candidates decide, as it relates to fundraising, for example, that more of this can be done virtually and digitally, and does that save them time? So I think that will be something that's interesting to follow. Certainly as a reporter, I would much rather be out there on the ground talking to people and getting, as much as possible, getting a real sense of what is happening on the ground. You can tell the mood of a campaign a little bit better when you're seeing all these people in person. So certainly, I think presented challenges for the country in so many ways, and certainly upended the way that the presidential campaign was conducted. I think that some of the operatives on the campaign would say in some ways it saved them time. Some of the things that typically take up a lot of time but maybe aren't worth the investment, I wonder if they'll look at reconsidering and moving to a more virtual way.
Okay, Katie Glueck, New York Times. We really appreciate your taking the time to spend with us and talk about the election. It was great to have you on.
It was great to be with you. Thank you so much for having me. I appreciate it.
Okay, that was terrific. Thank you very much, Katie Glueck, and thanks to all of our viewers of this session. Hope you'll join us for our next post-election conference virtual session of the Dole Institute of Politics. Have a great day.
Thank you so much.